I knew. I knew everything. The moment she walked into that restaurant with him, the image became impossible to erase from my mind. The light laugh, the subtle touch of her hands, the way her eyes sparkled in a way I hadn't seen in years. Everything screamed betrayal. I found myself gripping the cell phone tightly, my heart beating at a frantic pace as anger pulsed through my veins. It was at that moment that I typed the message that would change everything. I know everything about you. I sent the message while she was having dinner with him, on what should have been an ordinary night for me. But there, amid glasses of wine and complicit glances, they were destroyed. I imagined their reactions, the panic, the shock on their faces, the dropping of the perfect disguise they had maintained for so long. There was no more running away, no more excuses. I caught them in the act, and now, all that was left was to watch the pieces fall. For weeks, I had ignored the signs, those frequent outings, the increasingly elaborate excuses, the long nights out. She was distant, always with her cell phone nearby, her laugh was slightly forced when she looked at me. I tried to ignore it, I wanted to believe it was all in my head, that it was just paranoia, but the truth was right in front of me. Everything fell apart when I saw the messages on her phone. His messages. The promises, the insinuations, the way he talked about her. The pain was almost physical, as if something had pierced my chest. I didn't confront it right away. I waited. He was building revenge in silence, observing every move, every encounter. And then, when I finally put all the pieces together, when I knew it was impossible to deny, I chose that exact moment to act. Their dinner wasn't just a simple betrayal, it was the climax of a game of manipulation, of lies that intertwined. I knew more than they knew. And deep down, she knew I would find out. Maybe she was testing how far I would go, how long I could endure. Maybe he was waiting for my reaction. But nothing could prepare her for what came next. Anger mixed with disappointment. How could she do this to me? I gave everything. I followed your struggles, I was by your side in the greatest difficulties, and, in the end, I was left behind. She chose the path of betrayal and, what's worse, she didn't regret it. There wasn't even a hint of remorse in her eyes. Every word I exchanged with him, every time I met him, was like a blow to the trust one thought was unbreakable. Now, everything was at stake. It wasn't just physical betrayal, it was a symptom of something much bigger. It was the fact that she hid secrets from me, lies that were silently entwined. And the most painful? She was not alone in this betrayal. The truth was much crueler than a simple adventure. There was someone behind it all, someone who pulled the strings with precision, who urged her to cross that line. She was manipulated, but she also chose to give in. I needed to know why. I needed to understand how everything fell apart like this. I waited for her to come home that night. I knew that sooner or later the confrontation would be inevitable. When she walked through the door, her expression was a mix of surprise and guilt. There was no way to disguise it. The message I sent had made it clear that the game was over. She knew that I knew. But still, there was something else in her eyes, something I couldn't immediately decipher. A mix of regret and fear, as if something much bigger was coming. You read it, didn't you? I asked, my voice echoing through the room, calmer than I imagined. She tried to open her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The silence was deafening. I needed to know. Not just about the lover, but about what was hidden between the lines of this betrayal. There was something deeper, something she desperately tried to protect. What was she hiding? Who had led her to this? The real confrontation was yet to come. And with it, the revelation I could never have predicted. Boston was breathing cold that November afternoon. The sharp wind glided through the city's wide streets, and the imposing buildings seemed to absorb the gray sky that covered the city. Outside the room's large glass window, the hurried movement of people contrasted with the calm inside the spacious apartment. It was a home of years, built with dedication and patience, and every detail reflected the life together that Jake and Melissa had cultivated since the beginning of their marriage. A picture on the wall with the wedding photo still shined like new, even though it had been there for a decade. Jake had always been a meticulous, methodical man. Everything in his life followed a plan. He organized his days as if every minute was part of a carefully rehearsed choreography. His job as a financial analyst required precision, but he always found time for Melissa, even on his busiest days. She, in turn, possessed an opposite nature. Creative and expansive, Melissa worked as an interior decorator, always on the move, full of new projects, bringing color and life to the spaces she touched. The house they lived in reflected this duality well. The clean, straight lines Jake preferred were softened by Melissa's colorful, unexpected touches. In the first years of their marriage, the balance between them seemed natural. Jake loved the lightness Melissa brought to his life, while she anchored herself in the stability he offered. The differences, once charming, seemed to have become invisible barriers over the years. Small disagreements, which at first were just different points of view, became the core of increasingly frequent discussions. Melissa, once full of enthusiasm, seemed to always be distant, immersed in her worries or projects. Jake noticed this, but didn't know how to deal with it. He often wondered when things started to change. Maybe it was 2 years ago, when they started working at different times, rarely having dinner together. Or maybe when Melissa started accepting more work trips, spending long weeks away. Jake, in turn, felt that by keeping the household stable and providing financial security, he was doing his part. He believed that, with time, things would work out. But what he didn't realize was that the distance between them wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Last night had been a clear example. Melissa arrived late, with a tired smile that didn't reach her eyes. He watched her, in silence, as she hung up her coat and sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing her temples as if carrying the weight of something invisible. When he tried to start a casual conversation, talking about a new project at work, Melissa responded in monosyllables. She was there, but at the same time, she wasn't. Something inside her was miles away. Jake was never good at dealing with silence. He was a practical man, who believed that for every problem there was a logical solution, and the lack of dialogue between them left him uneasy. In recent months, the restlessness had become unbearable. He began to observe her more closely, looking for signs of something he couldn't name. Sometimes it was the way she avoided talking about the future. Others, the way she clammed up when he asked about work. And recently, there were the messages on his cell phone that Melissa quickly hid, as if she didn't want him to see them. But he didn't want to think the worst. After all, they had a history. 10 years of marriage, ups and downs, achievements and defeats. Jake always believed that, despite the difficulties, they would find a way back to each other. He still loved her. The feeling was there, despite everything. It was the same love that made him prepare coffee every morning, even though he knew she no longer sat at the table with him. The same love that kept him from confronting her directly, afraid that his suspicions would prove true. Gradually, however, he began to notice the subtleties. Melissa wasn't the same. Her laugh, which before filled the room with lightness, now seemed just a reflection of something she was trying to maintain. Her answers were vague, and her eyes rarely met his. The trips became more frequent, the excuses more elaborate, and the nights when she was away from him on the couch, more and more constant. That morning, as Melissa hurried off to yet another meeting, Jake stood in the doorway, watching her cross the street and disappear around the corner. He felt a strange cold in his chest, a feeling that something was approaching. A turning point, perhaps. Or a revelation he didn't want to face. He tried to push these thoughts away while working, but the feeling remained. The image of Melissa, so far away, never left his head. It was as if a shadow hung over their marriage, something unspoken that was about to explode. Deep down, he knew he couldn't keep ignoring it. The house they lived in, silent and organized, reflected what was left of their relationship. Everything was in its place, but life was missing, the heat that previously filled the days and nights was missing. Jake felt this every second he was alone in the silence of the apartment. And this silence, once companionable, was now oppressive. While Melissa was away, he found himself going through old messages on her cell phone, remembering moments when things seemed simpler. Some nights, he would go through old photos stored on his computer, looking for some sign of when everything had changed. But the answers weren't there. They were in another place, in something he hadn't yet discovered. Something that was hidden in the details of the days and in the increasingly present absences. With each new look, with each new silence between them, Jake felt the distance grow. He knew he needed to find out the truth, but at the same time, he feared what would come next. The days that followed were a series of silences and broken routines. Jake and Melissa shared the same roof, but not the same life. The distance was more than physical, it was an impenetrable emotional barrier. Jake continued his silent search for answers, as if something inside him already knew what was coming, but he wasn't ready to face it yet. One night, as Melissa prepared for another of her work meetings that were now stretching late into the night, Jake watched intently. There was something different about his behavior. She was more nervous, checking her cell phone frequently, adjusting her dress with shaking hands. He felt the bitter taste of doubt, but the doubt would soon turn into certainty. "Are you going out again?" Jake's question echoed through the room with a more serious tone than he intended. Melissa looked at him, surprised, and for a brief moment she hesitated before answering. "Yes, it's an important meeting. I shouldn't be long." Your smile seemed forced, your eyes avoided his. Jake nodded silently, but the weight of distrust had already sunk in deep. He knew tonight would be different. Something in his instinct, which he had learned to trust over the years, warned him of an imminent confrontation. When Melissa walked out the door, he made a decision. He took out his cell phone and, after taking a deep breath, accessed the application he had installed months before, something he had sworn to himself he would never use. A silent tracker. The phone's screen flashed, and within seconds Melissa's location appeared. It wasn't the company's headquarters, nor near a place where he knew she usually went. It was a restaurant in the city center. The time it took Jake to leave the house and drive to the restaurant seemed like an eternity. The mind was buzzing with uncontrolled thoughts. Every minute was torture, with painful and confusing images of possible scenarios. He tried to prepare himself for what he would encounter, but he knew that no amount of emotional preparation would be enough. When he parked the car some distance away, he looked at the restaurant through the windshield. The soft lights and intimate atmosphere made it the perfect place for a discreet meeting, away from prying eyes. He got out of the car slowly, as if the weight of his own feet wanted to stop what was coming. His eyes swept the room in search of Melissa. And there she was. Sitting at a table in the corner, next to another man. Her laugh was different. It wasn't the same one he knew. There was something more there, an intimacy that cut Jake like a cold blade. They were together, laughing and sharing secrets he didn't know. No further proof was needed. Everything was there, in plain sight, like a silent confession. His chest tightened, his eyes burned, and for a second, he thought about turning his back and just walking away. Pretend that I had never seen it, that maybe I was just imagining the worst. But the betrayal was before his eyes, and it was undeniable. Unable to control it, Jake picked up his cell phone, his fingers shaking as he typed the short, cruel message, "I know everything about you." He watched from afar as Melissa, laughing with a glass of wine in her hands, picked up her phone to check the notification. Her smile froze. She looked at the man in front of her, then at the screen, and a shadow of panic covered her face. The man also checked his cell phone shortly afterwards. They both exchanged scared looks. The moment of relaxation turned into a scene of silent despair. She knew she had been discovered. And Jake, outside, watched everything. Jake didn't go in. This was no time for explosive confrontations. He wanted more than a scene, he wanted to understand what had led Melissa there. The answers were still hidden, like pieces of a puzzle that he had barely begun to put together. But now, with the certainty of betrayal staring him in the face, it was impossible not to feel the crushing weight of reality. He drove home in silence, his hands firmly on the steering wheel as his head filled with questions. What would she say? What would be your excuse? He tried, but he couldn't feel anger only at her. It was as if a part of him knew there was something more, something he didn't yet see. There were more pieces to this plot, and he needed to find out what was missing. Arriving home, the waiting began. Every minute felt like an eternity as he tried to calm himself. I knew Melissa would return soon, but the answers? These might not come as easily. The front door opened silently. Melissa entered, her posture tense, her eyes wary as if she was expecting an imminent storm. She looked around but didn't see Jake. He walked around the house, trying to act naturally, but he knew something was different. Jake was in the office, silent, waiting. She finally found him, guilt written all over her face, but speechless. The tension was palpable. Jake looked at her, without anger, just with a look that demanded answers. She opened her mouth, but the lie she planned to tell didn't come out. I knew I was cornered. The confrontation was no longer avoidable. Now, she would need to explain. The room was immersed in an uncomfortable, dense silence. Melissa was standing in front of Jake, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if there she found refuge from the pain that was to come. Jake, sitting in the leather armchair in the corner of the office, watched her silently. There was no more room for evasive words or vague excuses. The confrontation he had so avoided for months was before them, and he knew there would be no return. So, that's it, Jake finally broke the silence, his voice cold, almost indifferent. How long were you planning to keep this up? Or did you think I would never find out? Melissa took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment, as if trying to gather the strength to face what she was about to say. Jake, she began, but her voice trailed off. She knew that any attempt to smooth over the situation would be futile. The truth was finally cornered and there was no escaping it. Jake stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on Melissa, observing every slightest gesture, every trace of guilt that appeared on her face. Who is he, Melissa? He asked, his voice now firmer, a mixture of pain and suppressed anger. You owe it to me. Who is he? She hesitated, her breathing ragged. I knew his name didn't matter anymore, but the circumstances, those did. She felt the weight of everything she had done, and now, there was no escape. It's Mark, she finally said, her voice low, almost a whisper. Jake pulled away, anger boiling under his skin. The name sounded hollow to him, a stranger that had infiltrated his life, but still, it wasn't a complete revelation. Something was missing. Why, Melissa? He asked, now with an unmistakable bitterness. What does he have that I don't? I thought we were happy. Melissa finally looked up at him, tears glistening. She could no longer run away from the truth, nor from herself. I don't know, Jake. I got lost. His words came out choppy, shaky. It's not about you. It never was. I felt suffocated, trapped, and he appeared. Jake stared at her, feeling his heart sinking deeper with each word. It was as if everything he believed in was crumbling in front of him, brick by brick. He approached slowly, stopping a few centimeters from her, his gaze fixed on Melissa's teary eyes. And you thought he was the way out? Jake's voice now carried more than pain. There was desperation, a need to understand, to find a reason to justify the chaos she had caused. You thought that betraying everything we built, sleeping with another man, would free you from what, exactly? Melissa trembled under the weight of the accusation. She knew her actions were inexcusable, but the truth was much more complex than it seemed. She moved a little closer, reaching out her hand hesitantly, but Jake pulled away, refusing the touch. It's not just that, Jake. His voice wavered, as if he were about to break down. I was confused, vulnerable, but there's more you need to know. Jake stared at her, waiting. He already knew about the betrayal. What else could there be? Melissa turned, walking slowly to the window, where the moonlight faintly entered the room. She looked out, as if the view might offer some sort of solace. I didn't plan any of this, she began, the words faltering. I never wanted to hurt you, but things have changed. And it wasn't just my fault. Jake frowned. He didn't understand. What do you mean, it wasn't just your fault? Are you passing the responsibility onto someone else now? Melissa shook her head, without turning to face him. She was on the precipice, knowing that once she told the truth, there would be no going back. I was influenced, Jake. He laughed humorlessly, crossing his arms. Influenced? By whom? For Mark. Melissa finally turned around, her face etched with guilt and fear. No. By someone much closer. Someone we know very well. Someone who always had ulterior motives. Jake's heart skipped a beat, suspicion growing. He could see the hesitation in Melissa's eyes, the guilt burning in her expression. But it didn't make sense. Who could have manipulated Melissa? Who would have so much control over their decisions? And then, the answer came, like a violent shock. Claire, she said, and the name hung in the air, heavy and loaded with meaning. Jake blinked, confused. Claire. Your best friend. What does she have to do with this? Melissa took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but the words came out like a painful confession. She was always behind everything, Jake. From the beginning. She encouraged me, told me things I didn't even know I needed to hear. You said I deserved more, that you would never understand what I really wanted in life. And I believed her. She convinced me that I was unhappy, that Mark was the answer. Jake felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Claire. The woman he had known for years, Melissa's closest friend, who had always been present in their lives. The same Claire he trusted and believed to be a pillar for Melissa during her difficult times. Are you telling me that Claire manipulated you into this? The disbelief in Jake's voice was evident. She wanted to destroy our marriage. Melissa nodded slowly, unable to hold Jake's gaze. She was always there for me, telling me what I needed to hear, or what she thought I needed. I was blind, Jake. And by the time I realized she was playing me, it was too late. Jake started pacing around the room, running his hand through his hair, unable to process everything at once. The pieces began to fall into place in his mind. The times Claire appeared, always ready to support Melissa, always present in moments of crisis. The conversations where she seemed to plant little seeds of doubt, disguised as advice. Why would she do that, Melissa? What does Claire want with our life? Melissa hesitated again, the silence that followed was even heavier than before. She wants you, Jake. The words came out and hit Jake like a shockwave. He stopped in the middle of the room, his mind spinning. Did Claire want him? How has he never seen this before? Every gesture, every look she secretly threw, now made sense. She had constructed a careful plan, using Melissa as a pawn to destroy his marriage, to drive him away from his wife and eventually get closer to him. Jake couldn't believe it. Melissa's betrayal was already devastating, but realizing there was an even darker plot behind it all, was too much to bear. She used me, Jake, Melissa whispered, her voice barely audible. You used me to keep you away from me. And I let you. Jake stared at her, shock turning into a mixture of anger and disappointment. Now everything made sense. The reason why Melissa had changed, the doubts that appeared out of nowhere, Claire's constant manipulation. He was silent, processing the devastating truth. Jake felt the crushing weight of the silence that hung over them. Melissa, still standing by the window, looked small, almost unrecognizable to him. The confession about Claire had crumbled the last emotional defenses he had. Everything he thought he knew about his life, his marriage, and his friendships was in tatters. Shock still dominated his thoughts, but now, a deep dilemma began to arise in his heart. What would he do next? He crossed his arms and began to slowly walk around the room, his mind racing. The moral dilemma forming in his mind was suffocating. Melissa's betrayal was an open wound, one that might never heal. But now, there was this new layer, this dark game that Claire had led for so long in the shadows. Jake felt a fury rising inside him, but along with it, there was a kind of bitter understanding he never expected to find. Melissa, too, had been manipulated. He turned to her, his voice low, almost too controlled for the situation. You let yourself be carried away by her, by Claire. But, Melissa, you had a choice. Always has. And he chose to lie. He chose to betray. Melissa lowered her head, unable to look at him. I know, she whispered, the words filled with regret. But it wasn't that simple. I was so lost. She convinced me that there was no way back. I believed her words because I couldn't believe that you and I could be happy again. Jake stopped walking. Her words hit him hard in his chest. He felt the pain and despair in every sentence, but that didn't lessen the gravity of what had happened. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but now it was accompanied by a deep sadness, a sadness that came from seeing someone he loved so broken, so manipulated by someone they trusted. Did Claire always have this power over you? He asked, his voice calmer now but still filled with anguish. Always influencing you, telling you what to do, what to feel. I can't believe I never realized. Melissa shook her head slowly. She was always a friend. Or at least that's what I thought. She was there when I felt insecure, when you were distant because of work. She seemed to understand how I felt, but now I see that she was using my fears, my weaknesses, against us. The silence between them settled again, but this time it wasn't just emptiness. It was filled with a whirlwind of unspoken emotions, Jake's need to understand, to make a decision, but not knowing which way to go. He had the right to be angry, to walk away and leave everything behind. But at the same time, the complexity of the situation made everything seem more nebulous. He didn't want to be just another pawn in Claire's dirty game. She did it to be with me, didn't she? Jake finally asked, almost in disbelief. The idea that Claire would have set everything up to separate them and eventually get closer to him seemed absurd, but at the same time, everything was starting to fall into place. She took you away from me so I could turn to her. Melissa nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. She never said it outright, but I think so. After things between you and me got worse, she started getting closer to you, in ways I only realize now. The group dinners, the moments where she was always there to listen to you. I was blind, Jake. And now, I've lost everything. Jake walked away, trying to process everything he heard. Melissa's betrayal was, in itself, devastating. But the fact that Claire had orchestrated all this chaos to achieve her own goal made it all even more surreal. Now he had two betrayals to deal with, both painful and equally destructive. He wondered if he had the strength to forgive, or even to move on. Melissa watched him, as if she was waiting for the sentence he would deliver. She knew she didn't deserve his forgiveness, she knew the gravity of her mistakes were immense, but a small part of her still desperately hoped for a miracle. Jake took a deep breath, tension building in his chest. You gave me the answers I needed, but they don't lessen the pain I'm feeling. Claire may have manipulated you, but you made your own decisions. Now, I need to decide what to do with all of this. And I don't know if I can continue with this pain, Melissa. I don't know if I can look at you and not remember everything. His words fell heavily on her. Melissa sobbed, unable to control herself. The woman who had always been so sure of herself, so determined in her choices, was now torn apart. She knew Jake was right. And the cruelest thing of all was knowing that even if she begged for forgiveness, even if she tried to mend what she had broken, some wounds were too deep to heal. Jake watched her, anger beginning to give way to sadness. He wanted to hate her, but he couldn't. There was much more at stake than just betrayal. He saw the fear in her eyes, the pain she also carried from having allowed someone to manipulate her so deeply. And this pain, as much as he wanted to ignore it, affected him in a way he didn't expect. "I need time," he said, almost in a whisper. "I don't know what I'm going to do, but I need time." Melissa nodded through her tears, knowing it was the most she could ask for at that moment. Jake left the office, leaving her alone, lost in the echoes of her own choices. She knew Jake's internal struggle was far from over. Jake spent days trying to deal with the whirlwind of emotions that surrounded him. Melissa's betrayal was a wound that, even with time, didn't seem to heal. He had asked for space, but he knew that wouldn't solve the chaos that was now his life. The silence between them, which had previously been uncomfortable, was now almost unbearable. Melissa respected the distance, knowing that any more word could be the final straw to shatter any hope of reconciliation. Jake, however, couldn't get Claire out of his mind. The fact that he was manipulated by someone he blindly trusted was eating away at him. She had infiltrated his life, destroyed his marriage, and worst of all, he had never suspected. He felt foolish for having believed in her good intentions, for having let her get so close. Now, he could no longer ignore what needed to be done. Without warning, Jake arranged a meeting with Claire. He found her in the cafe they used to go to with Melissa, as if he wanted that moment to be surrounded by memories that once seemed happy, but were now just pieces of a lie. Claire arrived smiling, as if she was oblivious to what had been revealed. Jake watched her for a few minutes, in silence, as she casually talked about her life, as if nothing had happened. As if he was still the friend he had always been. When she finally noticed Jake's serious look, Claire stopped talking, the expression on her face slowly transforming. She knew something had changed, but she tried to maintain her composure. "Jake, what is it? Why all this seriousness?" Jake leaned across the table, eyes fixed on her. "I know everything, Claire. All. About what you did to Melissa. What did you try to do to me?" Claire stepped back, her eyes wide. For a moment, she tried to laugh, but the tension in her body gave away the panic that was beginning to emerge. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't act like you don't understand." Jake interrupted, his voice firm but calm. "You used Melissa's vulnerability to push me away, to destroy what we had. And now, you will have to deal with the consequences." Claire could no longer hide her fear. She tried to justify her actions, but the truth was inescapable. I just wanted you to realize that she wasn't good for you. Jake, you deserve better, you deserve someone who truly understands you. Melissa didn't value you, and I valued you the whole time." Jake shook his head in disappointment. "You manipulated me, Claire. And worse, you destroyed the only thing that kept me connected to my life. This is not love. That's selfish." She tried to hold his hand across the table, but Jake yanked his arm back. "It ends here," he said, standing up. "I never want to see you again. And if you have a modicum of respect, you'll stay away from Melissa too." Claire sat there, unresponsive, while Jake walked away without looking back. She realized, at that moment, that she had lost everything. Her friendship, her chance with Jake, and, in a way, even herself. Back at his apartment, Jake faced Melissa. She was more fragile, beaten down by the days of tension and the guilt she carried. As he approached, she waited for the inevitable end. Maybe he would ask for a divorce, maybe he would say there was no future for them anymore. What Melissa didn't expect was what came next. "Claire isn't going to bother us anymore," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "I ended everything with her. And now, Melissa, it's our turn." She looked at him, surprised, not knowing what that meant. Jake sat in front of him, looking tired but determined. "I don't know if I can forgive you. Not now. But I know that, somehow, I also lost you to something bigger than the two of us. Claire played on our weaknesses, and I let that happen. We both left." Melissa started to cry, but Jake stopped her with a calm gesture. "I'm not ready to give you an answer right now. But I want to at least try to understand how we got here. I want you to do the same." She nodded, with silent tears, no words to express the relief mixed with the pain. Jake didn't promise forgiveness. He didn't promise they would be together. But he gave her a chance, an opportunity to rebuild something, even if it was just mutual respect. The weeks that followed were of silence and reflection. Jake distanced himself from Claire and, little by little, Melissa began to show genuine regret. She knew the road would be long and that Jake might never forgive her completely, but for the first time in a long time, she was willing to fight for something true. Not out of pride, not out of fear, but out of love, a love that she had almost destroyed, but that somehow still held on. Their future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: they were no longer the same people they had been before the betrayal. Jake had found the strength to confront the shadows in his life, and Melissa had found her way back to herself. Claire, in turn, was completely alone, a victim of her own manipulations. Each person's destiny had been shaped by their choices. Now, only time could reveal what the next chapter would be for Jake and Melissa. And you, what did you think of this story? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know how you think Jake and Melissa should move forward. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more exciting stories full of twists and turns. And remember, this channel does not support any type of cheating.